going to be coming up at around 9 o'clock at night in a perfectly timed circadian rhythm, as we talked about. But when you have cortisol levels that are not aligned correctly, so your circadian rhythm is off, cortisol pulses that are shifted later in the day can be correlated with conditions of anxiety and also depressive disorders. Also, bright light is a strong stimulus for cortisol levels coming up in the morning. Again, another reason why you want to have bright light stimulation early in the morning when you're getting up, because that allows the cortisol levels to come up, and that's going to time the melatonin levels later in the evening. So remember that cortisol is a very important hormone. It's a steroid hormone. It goes into the cells, goes into the nucleus, and it controls about 20% of the genome of your DNA. And so that if you have chronic stress, also remember that chronic stress increases cortisol levels above what they should be, and that can cause problems on down the road. So you want to have enough cortisol, you want to have it at the right time, and you don't want too much of that cortisol. So again, another important reason why you want to have bright light exposure in the morning to anchor the circadian rhythm and to make sure your cortisol levels are coming up at the right time.
Introducing Valvax 3.0 travel jackets with 15 features. The world's best travel jacket. Now minimalistic, yet still highly functional. 3 colors that can be dressed up, down, or worn classic. After researching eco-friendly functional fabric, we landed on eucalyptus, sustainably sourced and sustainably made. It's not only environmentally friendly, it's thermoregulated.
I've heard there's been some research about melatonin being connected with cancer rates. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so the thing that we have to remember is that even a small amount of light can completely shut down melatonin production in the pineal gland. And so if melatonin is the antioxidant and the sleep signal that we need, if it gets shut down, is that going to cause problems? We talked earlier that potentially some of the problems are, related to cancer. And so there's been some research on this, and it has been associated with an increased risk of cancers, specifically breast cancer, and specifically the type of breast cancer that is not responsive to hormonal therapy. There's been also some other research that has gone into this, and the WHO has classified circadian disruptive shift work as a probable carcinogen because of this connection. Interestingly, in patients who've become blind because of the severing of the optic nerve, remember, not only is the rods and cones sending neuron axons through the optic nerve, but also these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells send their axons through the optic nerve. And so, ostensibly, if you were to have these things severed, there would never be input to the suprachiasmatic nucleus to shut down melatonin production at that time of the circadian rhythm. And what they've actually found in some studies is that there is a reduced cancer risk in totally blind people. There was a relative risk of 0.69, meaning that they were 69% as likely to get cancers as people who were not blind. And again, with these studies, we'll go ahead and put links in the description below so you can look at these studies yourself.
So we spoke earlier about how important it is in the evening, once the sun goes down, to dim lights. You're going to have lights, try to have them below the level of your eye, avoiding bright screens. If it gets dark pretty early, like it does in Oregon, where I live, the first thing I would think of doing is reading more at night. And I have an e-reader. A lot of people read on their iPhone or their tablet. So what is the consequence of doing this? And if we can't use e-readers, what should we use?
Yeah, so you can imagine looking at a book using a light bulb reflecting off of a regular book, print book, versus an iPhone or an iPad or an e-reader. What would be the difference? You would think that they would be about the same. There was a paper that was published in 2015 that looked at that very question. As you can see here, what they measured was the irradiance of the e-book versus the print book. And you can see here we have irradiance on the y-axis, and we have it broken down into wavelengths. What we have here up top is the ebook, and you can see clearly that, especially in the blue range, there's quite a lot of irradiance coming out at that point. What you probably might have a hard time seeing, is because it's so low, is looking at a print book in regular light, and you can see clearly that there's a huge difference in the irradiance between the ebook and the regular print book. So again, it would be better for you to read at night using a regular print book than reading off of your iPhone, iPad, or an e-reader.
What is spectral irradiance? And the other question I have is, did it matter in the study whether the light source for those using a regular book, not an e-reader, was LED light or incandescent or something else, or what did they use in the study?
So in the study, they simply said very dim light. So they didn't mention if it was an LED light or an incandescent bulb. But in terms of irradiance, as you can see there from the units, are microwatts per square centimeter. So that's basically how much energy there is, and it's very similar to what we would say lux would be.
Okay, so this study established that there's more light energy, significantly more, coming towards the eye from an e-reader as opposed to just a regular book with a dimly lit room. Did that have any consequence on someone's sleep or their health?
Well, if you look at sleep latency, which is the time it takes for somebody to fall asleep, you'll see that it was much longer in those who were watching the e-book than those who were reading the book in dim light. In the study, it also showed that those subjects that were reading with the e-book felt more sleepy the next day when they got up. In other words, they had more sleep inertia.
Okay, Dr. Schwell, to summarize, can you give some specific recommendations for optimal light viewing and avoiding light in the evening?
Yeah, so let's summarize exactly what the recommendations are. Number one, in the morning, view sunlight as soon after waking up as possible, ideally before 9 o'clock in the morning. Look, there's nothing better than going outside as the sun is coming up. There is much more light outside than you're ever going to be able to generate inside. But if you have the issue where the sun is not up, or it's very cloudy where you live, you can aim for about 10,000 lux. Spend about 20 to 30 minutes a day in the morning. You want to be anywhere between 11 and 15 inches from the light box. So that's one option, but again, nothing beats actually going outside. Remember when we talked about lux, that on a bright sunny day, it's about 100,000 lux. You can get that very, very quickly. Remember that the photoreceptors in the retina in the morning are not very sensitive, so you need to have very bright light to activate it, but it's kind of integrated over time. So if it's not very bright, you have to spend a longer amount of time. If it's very bright, then you don't have to spend much time at all. If you're in very bright light, 30 seconds may be all that you need if it's 100,000 lux. On a cloudy winter day, like we were just talking about, it could take up to 30 minutes. But again, making sure that you're getting your eyes looking at bright light in the morning. You want to avoid sunglasses. You want to avoid windows. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but especially the low E glass. That's very effective at filtering out infrared light. You don't want windshields. That doesn't really count. You want to get outside and have nothing between you and the light source. Again, avoiding blue blockers. We talked about how blue light stimulation is really key at that time of the day. So make sure that you're getting as much stimulation as possible. In terms of what you should do in the evening time, after the sun goes down, is to limit as much light as possible after sunset. You want to have any kind of light that you have as low as possible. You want to have it as red as possible. And you want to have it as dim as possible, so that you can have the benefit of melatonin secretion from the pineal gland when the time is right. Remember what we said, that intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are more activated by blue light. So if you have no choice, if you have to do something, it's better to make sure that the blue light aspect is reduced, either by programming it into the computer or by wearing blue blockers, glasses. That really is the two aspects of this portion of the talk, where we talk about how light interacts with the human body in a circadian rhythm way. What should you do in the morning? Number one, sunlight before 9 o'clock, anywhere between 30 seconds and 30 minutes, depending on how much sun there is, because remember that these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are not very sensitive in the morning, so it takes time. But the good news is that there's integration, which means that the more time you spend, the more activated they're going to be. So if there's bright sun, it might only take 30 seconds. But if it's cloudy, if it's a dim day, if you're getting up early before the sun comes up, it might take as much as 30 minutes. So because of that, you don't want to be wearing sunglasses. You definitely don't want to be wearing blue blockers because blue light is really good at this point. You don't want to be behind a window or a windshield. It's okay to have glasses or contacts. Because if you do, if you wear the sunglasses, if you're behind a window or the windshield, it's going to take a lot longer to get the stimulation that you're going to need otherwise. The other option is you do it inside, and you get this 10,000 plus lamp that has 10,000 lux, and spending about 20 to 30 minutes in the morning, about 11 to 15 inches away from the light box, is going to be what you need to really anchor and to get the light stimulation that you need, to get the cortisol secretion that you need, and also the melatonin timing, and to really set the circadian rhythm right. Now, to keep that going, what are you going to do in the evening? Really, it's this basic, understanding that photons, light that's going to the retina, is going to shut down melatonin production. You really want to have the lights as dim as possible. If you do have lights, have them as low down in your environment as possible, because we talked about that light down low around the floor, lower part of the walls, is not going to stimulate the suprachiasmatic nucleus as much and therefore shut down melatonin production. And then again, if you have it more towards the red aspect of the spectrum, yellowish, reddish, that type of thing, then you're also not going to shut down melatonin production. Think about fire. It's low down, it's dimmer, and it is redder. Those are the types of things that are going to be beneficial for you at night.
Если вы планируете открывать кофейню, в первую очередь вам нужно зарегистрировать ИП или ООО. Мы это сделаем вам абсолютно бесплатно. После открытия расчетного счета вам нужно будет подключить онлайн-кассу.
I would have thought that sitting in front of a window with full sunlight coming at me through the window would be almost as good as being outside. Or if I'm driving my car, on my way to work or whatever it may be, if I'm driving right at the sunlight, it seems like that would suffice. But you're saying that there's a huge difference between actually being outside viewing light and being behind a window. Do I have that right?
Yes, you do have that right. So if we look here at a family living room, ostensibly with windows, you're talking about 50 lux in terms of intensity versus an overcast day, which you would think about the same. That's 20 times higher in intensity at 1,000, and that's just an overcast day. So going full daylight and even direct sunlight, much, much higher. We really have a poor sense because our pupils adjust and our eyes adjust to light when we go inside versus outside. Outside there is tremendously more lux in terms of light than there is inside.
And I'll add that if anyone wants to play around with how much lux is in their environment, whether it's outside or inside, there are a variety of apps for your smartphone of choice. Some of them involve actually getting a white piece of paper and creating a filter for your light sensor on your phone. But you can measure the amount of lux in your environment at home so you can get a sense of where you are.
So this is the second part of our talk where we talk about how light interacts with our bodies and the mitochondria that I referred to at the beginning. This is really interesting. It was mind-blowing when I first learned about it, and I imagine that most of you out there probably have not heard this before. So as we talked about, the mitochondria are the portions of the cell which are the powerhouses. They make energy, and they make ATP similarly to how an engine in a car makes locomotion. But the problem is with locomotion, heat is generated around the engine, and that heat can stand to shut down the engine if it's not dealt with in an appropriate way with a cooling system. Same thing with the mitochondria. The byproduct of making energy is oxidative stress. And as we talked about before at the beginning, let's review a little bit. The mitochondria, if they're not cooled down, to use the analogy, oxidative stress can happen. And oxidative stress can lead to less optimal health, inflammation, cancer, dementia, diabetes, and even learning disabilities. And as we'll talk about later, it's been implicated with COVID-19 mortality. So how does the body deal with this? As we talked about earlier, we know that at night, melatonin is secreted from the pineal gland, normally, if the person is not being exposed to light, and this melatonin is actively secreted and actively taken up into the cell, and then it goes into the mitochondria, where it is the major antioxidant. It actually is the one that controls glutathione. It's twice as potent as vitamin E. But the question is while this is happening at night, that's great, but what happens during the day when more energy is needed and essentially these mitochondria are revving up at higher RPMs? What happens then? Well, scientists are now discovering that infrared radiation from the sun actually directly stimulates the mitochondria to produce melatonin on site where the oxidative stress is occurring. Now, this is not from eating melatonin or taking a supplement. This is actually from the sun itself, penetrating down into the tissue, stimulating the mitochondria to produce melatonin. There was this very interesting paper that was published by Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder, one of them a professor and the other one a light engineer, that described this, and I would highly recommend looking at this article. I'll put a link in the description below. But what they said in this article, and these are the highlights, is that melatonin we know is a potent antioxidant and that it's actually produced within the mitochondria in response to sunlight and provides targeted protection of the mitochondria from reactive oxygen species. It's also protective against a wide range of diseases that are identified with mitochondrial dysfunction, including cancers, neurodegenerative diseases, cardiovascular disease, and also diabetes. And it may have a role in the prevention of diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and even, as we'll talk about, COVID-19. So let's take a little bit more closer look at what's going on in the mitochondria and why this is happening. So let's talk about what's going on here. You have to understand that all of the cells in your body have things called mitochondria. And the mitochondria are these powerhouses or power plants inside the cell that make energy. And the product of that metabolism is something called ATP. And ATP is the molecule of energy for the cell. So let's take a look at the mitochondria in a little bit more detail. So if we look at mitochondria, there's an outer membrane, and the problem is with locomotion, heat is generated around the engine, and that heat can stand to shut down the engine if it's not dealt with in an appropriate way with a cooling system. Same thing with the mitochondria. The byproduct of making energy is oxidative stress. And as we talked about before at the beginning, let's review a little bit. The mitochondria, if they're not cooled down, to use the analogy, oxidative stress can happen, and oxidative stress can lead to less optimal health, inflammation, cancer, dementia, diabetes, and even learning disabilities. And as we'll talk about later, it's been implicated with COVID-19 mortality. So how does the body deal with this? As we talked about earlier, we know that at night, melatonin is secreted from the pineal gland, normally, if the person is not being exposed to light, and this melatonin is actively secreted and actively taken up into the cell, and then it goes into the mitochondria, where it is the major antioxidant. It actually is the one that controls glutathione. It's twice as potent as vitamin E. But the question is while this is happening at night, that's great, but what happens during the day when more energy is needed and essentially these mitochondria are revving up at higher RPMs? What happens then? Well, scientists are now discovering that infrared radiation from the sun actually directly stimulates the mitochondria to produce melatonin on site where the oxidative stress is occurring. Now, this is not from eating melatonin or taking a supplement. This is actually from the sun itself, penetrating down into the tissue, stimulating the mitochondria to produce melatonin. There was this very interesting paper that was published by Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder, one of them a professor and the other one a light engineer, that described this, and I would highly recommend looking at this article. I'll put a link in the description below. But what they said in this article, and these are the highlights, is that melatonin we know is a potent antioxidant and that it's actually produced within the mitochondria in response to sunlight and provides targeted protection of the mitochondria from reactive oxygen species. It's also protective against a wide range of diseases that are identified with mitochondrial dysfunction, including cancers, neurodegenerative diseases, cardiovascular disease, and also diabetes. And it may have a role in the prevention of diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and even, as we'll talk about, COVID-19. So let's take a little bit more closer look at what's going on in the mitochondria and why this is happening.
So let's talk about what's going on here. You have to understand that all of the cells in your body have things called mitochondria. And the mitochondria are these powerhouses or power plants inside the cell that make energy. And the product of that metabolism is something called ATP. And ATP is the molecule of energy for the cell. So let's take a look at the mitochondria in a little bit more detail. So if we look at mitochondria, there's an outer membrane and there's an inner membrane. The center we call the matrix. And the space around it we call the intermembrane space. Let's zoom in a little bit and take a better look at what's going on there. Here we see the intermembrane space, and here we see the matrix. In the matrix, we have something called Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle is where carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are metabolized. And they enter into Krebs cycle at various different pathways, and they come from, obviously, the outside of the cell. The major byproduct of Krebs cycle is something called NADH. In addition to NADH, there's a small amount of ATP and GTP and other reducing agents, but the major product of Krebs cycle and the metabolism of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats is to make NADH. Now, NADH is a way of packaging very powerfully reduced electrons. So what's interesting now is how the mitochondria take these very reduced electrons and convert them into energy. And that's done with something called the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is basically a series of drops, almost like a dam, that goes through this electron transport chain. And at every step along this way, the energy from those reduced electrons from the NADH is coupled with a pump that pumps protons out into the intermembrane space, so that the amount of protons in the intermembrane space start to increase. And this occurs successively as the electrons are passed down step by step by step, until finally all of the energy is extracted from these electrons. And the final electron acceptor is something that we all need, and that's oxygen. And this is the reason why we need oxygen when we breathe, is we need an acceptor of those electrons. So this is where oxygen is required. Now, this is very important for you to understand. Finally, at the very end of this electron transport chain, there's an enzyme known as cytochrome C oxidase, or CCO for short. That takes this oxygen molecule and makes a water molecule out of it by passing on those electrons to this oxygen molecule. The problem is that when this stuff starts to go and these wheels start to turn, if you will, and these electrons start to be passed down the chain, it's not perfect, and sometimes you can have these electrons getting caught up with other oxygen molecules and something called reactive oxygen species being made. The most common one here being superoxide. But there are other ones as well, such as hydrogen peroxide and also hydroxy radicals. All of these are very dangerous substrates that can interact with the proteins around them and can cause severe damage. And the more damage they cause, the more likely there is to be more reactive oxygen species made. So it's very important that if and when these reactive oxygen species are made as a result of metabolism and this electron transport chain, that they get mopped up. More about that in just a second. But first, let's go back and talk a little bit about what happens with all these protons. So these protons start to build up, and then what occurs is finally there is a protein here that sits in the intermembrane space known as the FATPase. And simply what happens here is the protons go down their concentration gradient back into the matrix, and what you have is ADP becoming ATP,
as these protons go down their electron gradient. And here you have the product of this whole thing, which is ATP, which is, again, the high energy product of this entire process of metabolism. So you go from having carbohydrates, proteins, and fats into making ATP. In the process of this, you do need to use up oxygen. More importantly for our discussion today is you can't help but make reactive oxygen species. Well, the way that the body has of mopping this up, or making sure that these things go away, is through melatonin. So there is, of course, melatonin outside the mitochondria, outside the cell, that can come in and mop up these things very quickly, because melatonin is a very powerful antioxidant. But now we're finding out that specifically this last enzyme that we talked about, cytochrome C oxidase, which takes this oxygen molecule and makes it into water and makes this process go well, when this enzyme, cytochrome C oxidase, is excited with a certain wavelength of light, specifically infrared light, it actually increases melatonin production inside of the mitochondria. That's right, melatonin is produced inside the mitochondria as a result of the activation of this electron transport chain, which can then neutralize the product of the electron transport chain, which is not only water, but in certain cases, oxygen, as we mentioned, mixes with these electrons inadvertently, making these reactive oxygen species. Now, these reactive oxygen species, as we mentioned, are very dangerous, and they have to be dealt with on site because they react very quickly to products around them and can oxidize them and damage them. And as these things become damaged, they cause more oxidative stress and more mistakes and more superoxides and hydroxyperoxides and hydroxy radicals. And there are certain diseases associated with this, as we mentioned, Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's. These are all situations where the mitochondria are not acting appropriately, and we can talk about a number of other diseases that are also in line with this.
So what you're saying, Dr. Schwal, is infrared radiation from the sun stimulates something called cytochrome C oxidase, and that in turn tells the mitochondria in all of our cells to stimulate melatonin production?
In fact, this is not very well known, because this production of melatonin, Kyle, is happening inside the mitochondria. It's taken us a lot of time and energy and technology to be able to detect that type of level. Where we first detected melatonin was in the blood, and that's the backup plan at night. But what we're starting to find out is that melatonin production in the mitochondria is actually the front line cooling system for the mitochondria. As you can see here on this slide, less than 5% of the body's melatonin is produced in the pineal gland, and greater than 95% of the body's melatonin is produced on site in the mitochondria. This is a quote from Zimmerman and Ryder. He says, "It has now been shown that the mitochondria produce melatonin in many cells in quantities which are orders of magnitude higher than that produced in the pineal gland. This subcellular melatonin does not necessarily fluctuate with our circadian clock or release into the circulation system, but instead has been proposed to be consumed locally in the mitochondria in response to free radical density within each cell, in particular in response to near-infrared exposure." There's more to this quote, so bear with me. I'm going to go on here. Based on an optical and biological review of the literature, it is proposed that the near-infrared portion of natural sunlight, and we'll define that, stimulates an excess of antioxidants, like melatonin, in each of our healthy cells, and that the cumulative effect of this antioxidant reservoir is to enhance the body's ability to rapidly and locally deal with changing conditions throughout the day. In this approach, the role of the circulatory melatonin produced by the pineal gland is to provide an efficient method of delivering supplemental melatonin during periods of low cellular activity, that would be at night, and solar stimulus to damaged or aging cells in both diurnal and nocturnal animals. While circulatory melatonin may be the hormone of darkness, in other words, the pineal gland at night provided that there's no light hitting the retina. However, subcellular melatonin, that is intramitochondrial melatonin, may be the hormone of daylight. In other words, this intramitochondrial melatonin is a result
Я уже
of the
устал.
person
Сколько
going
можно?
out
Когда
into
уже
the
день
sunlight,
будет уже нормальный?
specifically
Да.
infrared radiation.
Question, Dr. Schwell, subcellular melatonin that is produced within the mitochondria of our cells during the day, does that have any effect on us feeling sleepy?
Совкомбанк возвращает проценты по кредитам. Как превратить 0 усилий в 3 миллиона? Кредит на крупные суммы от Совкомбанка. Быстрое онлайн-оформление. До 3 миллионов в тот же день. Совкомбанк. Для оформления просто перейдите по ссылке.
Я сделал шокирующее открытие. Наша Луна сошла с орбиты.
Мы имеем дело с разумной сущностью. И планируем атаковать эту штуку. Очень нужна твоя помощь.
Скажи да, Брайан. Падение Луны в кино с 3 февраля.
Not at all. So this is inside the mitochondria. And this is the reason why, to get this effect, you really can't take oral supplementation, because oral supplementation is going to go into the circulatory system eventually. And that's going to send off a whole bunch of signals to cells to tell them that it's time to go to sleep. This intramitochondrial melatonin is doing the job inside the cell, and it has nothing to do with sleep at all.
And to clarify, the primary way to get that is from natural sunlight.
That is correct. And we'll talk about other ways you could potentially get that as well.
So you mentioned infrared light coming from the sun, and specifically near infrared. Can we go back to that spectrum chart that you had that showed all the sun's energy? Can you explain near infrared in more detail?
Yes, so near infrared is just a aspect of the entire spectrum of light. Here we see the solar spectrum, and we're specifically looking at near infrared radiation. That is the part from 760 nanometers to 1400 nanometers, and you cannot see this. How you experience near infrared radiation or light from the sun is a feeling of warmth, and that is because this type of light from the sun can penetrate deep into the epidermis, the dermis, and even the subcutaneous tissue, depending on the wavelength, and it's perceived as heat because the transfer of this energy actually stimulates the heat receptors in our skin, and that is how it is felt. You'll often feel this, right? If you're in the sun and your back is to the sun and you've got a shirt on, you'll feel that warmth on the back. That is infrared radiation speaking to you. Why is it able to penetrate through clothes? It's actually able to penetrate quite deeply. Kyle, have you ever pulled up to a stop sign and a bunch of teenagers in a car pull up to you and they turn on their radio? What do you hear? All you're hearing is the boom, 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 right? That's the low frequency sound. That's because low frequency or long wavelength energy can penetrate through things fairly easily. And so that sound is penetrating their car, going across into your car, and it's vibrating your steering wheel. And that's because this type of light, this infrared, and specifically the near infrared energy, can penetrate very well through the atmosphere. It can penetrate very well all the way down through your clothes and into your skin and actually deep into your body. And it's able to have the effect that it has on many of the cells in your body as a result. So the purpose of this slide is to demonstrate that the majority of the energy coming from the sun and hitting the earth is in the infrared spectrum. Here we have infrared on the right side of this black bar. We have the visible spectrum here, and we have ultraviolet over here on the left. And as you can see, if we look at the red envelope here, we'll see that this is the amount of energy that's hitting the earth in the visible spectrum, but all of this red over here, and specifically right up to about 1400, all of this is the amount of energy that is coming through the atmosphere, hitting the earth in the infrared spectrum. So we're dealing with a large amount of energy. If we look at that energy as it hits the skin, notice that wavelengths that are longer tend to penetrate more deeply. The interesting thing about this is that infrared, which is out here, or specifically near infrared, can actually penetrate down, it is estimated, depending on which study you look at, anywhere from 1 centimeter up to 8 centimeters. And as you know, 1 centimeter is twice 5 millimeters. So you can see how deep this could actually go.
So does wearing sunscreen block infrared radiation into our skin?
While sunscreen and sunblock is very good at blocking ultraviolet light, it is not very good at all and actually has really no effect on the ability of the sun to radiate infrared and through the skin.
And you mentioned this earlier, but clothing, if I'm wearing a couple layers of clothing or maybe even a jacket, can I still get infrared radiation penetrating into my skin?
Well, it depends on how much you're wearing. So if it's a very large jacket, yes, especially a thermal jacket, because the way we experience heat, infrared is not going to penetrate that very well. But you can put on clothes that would prevent ultraviolet light from causing sunburns and things of that nature, but it would not prevent the infrared radiation from penetrating down into your skin.
So is a good rule of thumb that if I can feel the warmth from the sun on my skin, I'm probably receiving infrared radiation into my skin?
Yes, that would be a very good indication. So if we look at the paper from Zimmerman and Ryder, what they demonstrated here is that regardless of whether or not the skin is melanin rich or not, you can see here that this infrared light was able to penetrate down up to 8 centimeters into the skin. Some is reflected, but the point here is that infrared radiation can penetrate up to 8 centimeters according to some of their studies, and that is a significant amount in terms of depth and the amount of tissue that infrared radiation can actually affect. If we look at this picture here of a hand in visible light reflects off the surface of the skin. But near infrared light, at in this case 810 nanometers, penetrates down deep enough that it actually shows where the veins are under the surface. And this is actually used in the clinical setting to help nurses find veins. What's going on here is that the veins and the blood are absorbing the light and not reflecting it back, and that's how you're able to see these veins that are beneath the surface. What they did in their study is they looked at the number of cells totally in the human body with time. And you can see here that as a child grows, the number of cells in their body increases. In terms of the number of cells that near infrared can reach, because it penetrates so deeply, they were able to show that there is a large amount of cells in the human body that is accessible to near infrared radiation. That as opposed to ultraviolet and visible spectrum, which is down here at the bottom. So near infrared light, even though we can't see it, can penetrate very deeply, and it affects a number of our cells in our body. Of course, as we grow in girth, as we become more obese, for instance, the number of cells that are not able to be reached by near infrared radiation would become more and more. There is a physics of the near infrared radiation that has to be taken into consideration. What was very interesting to me was that near-infrared radiation could even penetrate bone. And what they showed here very elegantly was that near-infrared radiation can actually penetrate bone, and that the cerebral spinal fluid that surrounds the brain would diffuse the near-infrared radiation and would actually cause the sulci and the gyri, these are sort of the dips and the crevasses in the brain, to trap that near-infrared radiation and to reflect it down deep into these caverns so that the gray matter on the surface of the brain could be exposed to near-infrared radiation.
Dr. Schwartz, did I hear you right that sunlight can penetrate bone?
Yes, Kyle, I too was a little incredulous. I will put in the description below an article that actually demonstrates that sunlight can penetrate through the skull. But I remember back in addition to when I was taking a physical examination course in medical school, and what they showed, and what you'll see here on the screen, is a couple of screenshots from a YouTube video demonstrating the practice of transillumination. This is where on physical exam you try to see whether or not the sinuses are filled with mucus or if they're empty and open like they should be. In this case here on the top left, the examiner is shining visible spectrum light, not near infrared, but visible, into the frontal sinus. And you can see that it illuminates here, and you're able to see that it is completely clear. And that tells you, if you look down here, that is the bone that that light is shining through. And that tells you that the sinuses are clear. Here's another one here over on the right-hand side, except here the examiner is shining light on the maxillary sinus, and it's illuminating, and you can see clearly here inside the mouth. If you look up through the roof of the mouth, you're looking through the maxillary bone, and you can see that it is also trans-illuminating. So if visible light can go through bone, then you know that near infrared, which has a better propensity to travel through objects, can do it as well.
Покупайте на Авито с доставкой от 49 рублей по всей России.
So would I need to be actually out in the sun to get near infrared radiation?
No. In fact, Kyle, what this figure shows is that the light that comes from the sun is very rich in near-infrared radiation. What's even richer in near-infrared radiation is the light that reflects off of the green leaves and the trees and the grass. You see that most blue, green, and red materials have a very high near-infrared reflectance. And so actually what's coming to our eyes is light, especially if you're surrounded by greenery, that is very rich specifically in near-infrared radiation. So that when we look at the light that's actually coming to the eyes, over 90% of that light that's entering the eye isn't even doing so through the pupil. It's actually going around it because it's able to penetrate through this near-infrared radiation, not only the eye, but also the rest of the body, so that what we're seeing is light that is very rich in near-infrared radiation, and you actually don't even need to be into the sun.
So being outside in green spaces is a good place to be from a near-infrared radiation standpoint.
That's exactly correct, Kyle. Kyle, take a look at these near-infrared photographs. You'll see here that it's exactly, see that it illuminates down here clear. Here's a map. You know that near-infrared, which has a better propensity to travel through objects, can do it as well.
So would I need to be actually out in the sun to get near-infrared radiation?
No. In fact, Kyle, what this figure shows is that the light that comes from the sun is very rich in near-infrared radiation. What's even richer in near-infrared radiation is the light that reflects off of the green leaves and the trees and the grass. You see that most blue, green, and red materials have a very high near-infrared reflectance. And so actually what's coming to our eyes is light, especially if you're surrounded by greenery, that is very rich specifically in near-infrared radiation. So that when we look at the light that's actually coming to the eyes, over 90% of that light that's entering the eye isn't even doing so through the pupil. It's actually going around it because it's able to penetrate through this near-infrared radiation, not only the eye, but also the rest of the body, so that what we're seeing is light that is very rich in near-infrared radiation, and you actually don't even need to be into the sun.
So being outside in green spaces is a good place to be from a near-infrared radiation standpoint.
That's exactly correct, Kyle. Kyle, take a look at these near-infrared photographs. You'll see here that it's exactly as I'm talking about. You can see here the leaves, the grass, the plants, they're all bright white, almost like they have snow on them, and that's because they highly reflect near-infrared light so well. Here's a picture in Central Park, and you can see that the buildings are basically
So being outside in green spaces is a good place to be from a near-infrared radiation standpoint.
That's exactly correct, Kyle. Kyle, take a look at these near-infrared photographs. You'll see here that it's exactly as I'm talking about. You can see here the leaves, the grass, the plants, they're all bright white, almost like they have snow on them, and that's because they highly reflect near-infrared light so well. Here's a picture in Central Park, and you can see that the buildings are basically black because there's no reflectance there of near-infrared radiation, but you can see that the leaves and the trees are highly reflective of near-infrared radiation, and we're not in the sun here at this point. So that is very interesting to me because there's a lot of research, Kyle, that shows that there are health benefits when people are living in green spaces as opposed to concrete jungles. This is a paper that was published in Environmental Research. This was back in 2018, not too long ago. The title is The Health Benefits of the Great Outdoors, a systematic review and meta-analysis of green space exposure and health outcomes. They said, quote, we found that spending time in or living close to natural green spaces is associated with a diverse and significant health benefits. It reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, premature death and preterm birth, and increases sleep duration. People living closer to nature also had reduced diastolic blood pressure, heart rate, and stress. In fact, one of the really interesting things we found is that exposure to green spaces significantly reduces people's levels of salivary cortisol, a physiological marker of stress. Kyle, did you notice here that these are the same things that we talked about were the result of mitochondrial dysfunction? And we know now that green spaces are very good at reflecting near-infrared radiation. Take a look at this meta-analysis. You can see when they looked at all of these studies, this diamond here at the bottom means that when they looked at all of the studies and took the average of the results, because it did not touch this zero line right here, confirming that there was benefit for a subject of this study to be living in green spaces.
So this sounds like a really interesting theory, but do we actually have evidence that near-infrared impacts our mitochondria at the cellular level?
So let's take a look at this evidence. This was published in 2016. And what they did here was they took a laser at 1064 nanometers, perfectly within the near-infrared spectrum. And when they applied it to the skin and measured the concentration of cytochrome C oxidase, you can see that compared to the blue controls, the red laser increased cytochrome C oxidase levels until they turned off the laser, and then you could see that it went down. So clearly, cytochrome C oxidase in the mitochondria is reacting to this infrared laser. What they also noticed in the same area of the body was that oxygenated hemoglobin increased as well. So in other words, what we're seeing here is that the amount of blood supply going to this area increased. And as we'll see later, the predicate of this is increased nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It's also been implicated in antioxidant systems. And basically what we're seeing is when you have this type of radiation, near-infrared radiation, there is an excitation of cytochrome C oxidase that increases the amount of melatonin production. And we know that because of chemical studies that have shown the increase in melatonin relative to the enzyme that produces it, and also from serotonin, where it comes from in the mitochondria. It's also causing vasodilation, more blood coming to that area, and improved oxygenation to that tissue. More on those ends, you can see here that a paper that was published in 2017 titled Near-Infrared Light Stimulates Release of an Endothelium-Dependent Vasodilator and Rescues Vascular Dysfunction in a Diabetes Model. You can see here that light at 670 nanometers not only improved secretion of nitric oxide, but also caused smooth muscle relaxation. This is what they say in the article. In conclusion, 670 nanometer light energy produces acute increases in vessel diameter at physiological pressures through the release of a vasodilator from the endothelium. In vitro experiments identify and support the direct actions of light energy on cultured endothelial cells to produce nitric oxide independently from nitric oxide enzyme activity. We anticipate under pathological conditions of nitric oxide depletion, light energy should be considered a viable means for increasing nitric oxide, as evidenced by the significant stimulation of dilation in diabetic vessels. Thus, the acute increases in dilation observed by light energy suggest that it can provide an effective, non-invasive source for nitric oxide delivery. There have been many studies over a number of years enumerating the benefits of natural sunlight. We now know that infrared radiation, of course, is part of natural sunlight. There have been many people that have enumerated the benefits of natural sunlight. We have codes now in schools that specifically delineate how much light comes through the windows. And back then when they were making up these codes, those types of windows did not block infrared radiation. So it may be the reason why there was improved outcomes even in schools. You can see here in this table, there are a number of benefits with natural daylighting, as it says, on students. There's been also a number of specific studies that have looked at sunshine. This is a systematic review of sun exposure in type 2 diabetes and their outcomes. Here they looked at 11 different papers that evaluated sun exposure on type 2 diabetes. And you can see here that the number of outcomes, the highest evidence in this case was moderate, and it showed that there was a reduction in association with diabetes with direct sunlight exposure. There was another study that was done looking at 2 different cities in Europe. One was in the Netherlands, the other was in England. And what they did was very elegant. They took a lot of blood tests from these patients, and they were able, using weather reports, to look back over the last 7 days to see if there was a lot of sunlight during those past 7 days before the blood was given. Of course, it was a very large sample, and they were able to see if there was statistical significance between when blood samples were given when it was very cloudy versus when blood samples were given when it was very sunny, just before those samples were delivered. So as you can see here, over 13,000 subjects in this study. And what they showed here is after doing the model adjusting for age, sex, and percent body fat, and also season of the year, and also outdoor temperature to make sure that they corrected for all those, they were able to show that when the percentage of hours of sunlight in the last 7 days got less and less and less, there was worsening in glucose metabolism and also in lipid metabolism in those subjects. So let's talk a little bit about the actual amount of damage that light can do. We've talked about all the benefits of light, and we haven't really talked about the damage that light can do. Now what you see here is a spectrum of light going from the ultraviolet here on the left-hand side, and then the visible spectrum here with infrared going in this direction. As you can see on this graph, which is graphing basically the amount of radicals that are manufactured. So this is basically a graph of oxidative stress from light in the different categories. And you can see here that ultraviolet A is very adept at creating reactive oxygen species and oxidative damage. UVB also being somewhat high, but not as much. And you can see that as we go down in energy in terms of light, the amount of oxidative stress, the amount of damage is much, much less. The type of light that you want to avoid is ultraviolet radiation, not so much infrared. It does not cause as much damage. And that's important when we're understanding about when we're going to go out into the sun. What do we do about the concerns of melanoma and skin cancer and those sorts of things? Well, it's interesting because here was a study that was done, almost 1,000 cases of melanoma, looked at 513 in the population, and 174 sibling controls that were recruited in England, and they looked to see what was protective in the relationship between sun exposure and melanoma risk. And what they found was very interesting. They said, quote, overall, the clearest relationship between reported sun exposure and risk was for average weekend sun exposure in warmer months, which was protective. In other words, if you had weekend sun exposure, that reduced your risk of melanoma in these subjects. They say serum vitamin D levels were strongly associated with an increased weekend and holiday sun exposure. There's no surprise there. The more you're out in the sun, the more vitamin D you're going to be making from the ultraviolet B radiation. What about the risk factors for dying from melanoma? This was a study that was published back in 2005, and they looked at what things were associated with increased death in melanoma and what things were associated with a decreased death rate in melanoma. And you can see that things that were associated with an increased death risk was melanoma thickness, mitosis, ulceration, and head and neck placement. So mitosis is when you're seeing the cell divide under the microscope. Things that were associated with decreased death was actually things that are associated with being in the sun. So sunburn was actually associated with a decreased death. High intermittent sun exposure was decreased. Something called solar elastosis, that's kind of the damage that you have to your skin if you're out in the sun for too long, was actually associated with a decreased death rate. I'm not saying that going out into the sun you're going to be fine and never get melanoma. I want you to listen to your dermatologist. But remember that near-infrared radiation, the thing that stimulates melatonin production in the mitochondria, can penetrate through clothes. And so you don't need to go out into the sun directly. You don't need to be going out and sunbathing without protection. It can penetrate through clothes, it can penetrate through sunscreen. But just to say, you don't have to be afraid of going outside even when the sun is out. You can do this, and remember that the green leaves reflect a lot of that near-infrared radiation. Here's a study that was done titled Avoidance of Sun Exposure is a Risk Factor for All-Cause Mortality, results from the Melanoma in Southern Sweden cohort. This was a very large study, about 30,000 women selected at random, 35 to 64 years of age, in southern Sweden, and they were followed prospectively for 20 years. And there was about 2,500 deaths over those 20 years, and they asked about, did they go to the suntanning salon, or were they sunbathing? And this is what they showed in the data. They showed that those that had avoided sun exposure, they had sun-avoiding behavior, their survival rate was this line here at the bottom, whereas those that had the most active sun exposure were those here at the top. So this is a large study and a very large and long follow-up. Most students, of course, are fair-skinned, and so this can be something that's applicable to a population that's at risk for melanoma.
That was really interesting to see that graph with UVA and UVB and the amount of oxidative stress that those portions of the light spectrum cause relative to infrared. And most sunscreens that people buy these days are broad spectrum sunscreens, meaning they help block out both UVA and UVB. But I also want to ask about, you mentioned melanoma. There's other skin cancers out there. There's basal cell carcinomas and there's squamous cell carcinomas. They're not as deadly as melanoma typically, but what are your thoughts on, people that are concerned about all types of skin cancer and want to stay out of the sun, also because they don't want wrinkles. A lot of people want to avoid the sun for those reasons. So what's a strategy they can use to still get infrared radiation?
So I too am also very conscious of sun exposure. I mean, I'm pinning a little bit here on the top, so I wear a hat. So it protects me from the ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and obviously wearing clothes, shirts, things of that nature can do the same. But the key here is that infrared radiation can penetrate through those layers of clothing. So I can still feel the warmth of the sun on my head, even though I'm wearing a cap. And so, yeah, basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, even sun damage, actinic keratoses, these things are related to the oxidative stress that is occurring from that particular portion of the spectrum of light, which is in the ultraviolet spectrum. And that can be mitigated by making sure you're wearing sunscreen, that you're covering up, but you can still go out, even though you're covering up, into the outside and get that infrared radiation because it will penetrate those protective barriers.
And if you forgot your hat or you don't have a way to cover your skin or you forgot your sunscreen, can you still be in the shade and benefit from near infrared?
Well, absolutely. So remember that the sun is shining down on these green leaves, these plants, the grass, which are highly reflective of near-infrared radiation. So even though you're not in the sun, you could be in the shade, you're still getting the benefits of that near-infrared radiation that's hitting you, even though you're not in direct sunlight.
אבא שלי ראה אותי בפעם הראשונה שנולדתי. הוא החליט לעזוב את המשפחה. רציתי ליצור איתו קשר, להגיד לו שינסה לחזק אותי. גם אז הוא לא ענה לי. כל השנים אני ואמא שלי נלחמנו לבד.
Here's a paper that was done looking at the interdependence and contributions of sun exposure and vitamin D to MRI measures in multiple sclerosis. Now, I found this very interesting because scientists have known for a long time that multiple sclerosis has a higher incidence at higher latitudes. So, in conclusion, the results from our cross-sectional study suggest that sun exposure could have an effect on brain volume in multiple sclerosis. Now, remember we talked about how infrared radiation can penetrate the skull and actually can bathe the cerebral spinal fluid in near-infrared radiation and be trapped down deep into those sulci where the gray matter is. What they found here was that increased sun exposure seemed to improve the amount of gray matter and also brain mass, and it was dissociated from increased vitamin D levels as a result from that sun exposure. Let's take a look at this graph here. I found it very interesting. Here we have the multiple sclerosis patients up on top, and here we have the controls on the bottom. And what they did was they divided sun exposure into quartiles. So they had the people with the highest 25% of sun exposure, the third highest, the second highest, and then the lowest in all of these categories. And what they measured here in the first graph was the gray matter volume. In other words, how much gray matter was